I thought I'd start off with just a few little observations, one of which I've only intimately familiar with one of the three groups that just were up on stage here. I suspect that, because the other two are here, that they're good people and you should do the same thing for them. I'm going to recommend for the other, but every year for about the past 5 years, every summer I've given multiple lectures for Girls Who Code. And the chance to go in there, and don't just volunteer to do that, and volunteer for the others as well, whichever one sort of grabs you in the right level. But with Girls Who Code, don't just do the lecture, or if you genuinely have 6 weeks, teach the class, but don't just do the lecture. Go to the graduation ceremony at the end when they're there with their family. And believe me, they're not expecting you to show up. So they demo the projects they worked on throughout the whole class. And this one young woman demoed this game she played. And it was about developing resilience, and you had to leap through all these sorts of things. And she named the heroine of the game Vivienne, like the whole Frenchified spelling and everything, with no knowledge that I would actually show up and see this. And she was so embarrassed. But I mean, you want to feel like you touched someone, wait until they name the hero of their game after you. That moved me. But it's an opportunity to really have an impact. And, I happen to believe that there is more to life than just your social connections. But one thing I can say with great confidence, both from my own research and from the work of many others, is role modeling. The impact of a role model, of a peer role model, of a parent, of a caregiver, even someone that's just there transiently in their life. This is a huge drive in people's long-term outcomes. I mean, literally, how long they'll live, how happy they'll be, as well as the impact they have on society around them. So please, all of those groups, find the one that tickles your fancy and really go out there and do something worthwhile. The other thing I want to sort of clear out of here, it's a wonderful the Lady Eng invitation. But I'm kind of aware, as frequently the only woman on an AI panel at some, for example, the upcoming Milken Institute event and other ones, I feel uncomfortable that I'm the only one. Not just that there's only one woman on the stage, but that's not what I was born as. And it seems somehow a cheat to take someone that didn't spend their entire life with people telling them they couldn't do math, and then change later in life and have that be this one reputation, this one representation of what it means to have achieved something, for a woman to have achieved something in technology. And I think it's terrible. I know who I am. I am a woman who has gone through transition, much like someone might come through cancer, transformed, but it's something that happened in their past. But I recognize that my life is really wildly different than most of yours. And I think it's worth acknowledging that and not giving me or anyone else a free pass on the degree of our shared experience. However, I was recently in Prague at some conference, and I was getting on the plane to fly home, and someone was sitting in my seat. And I say, "Sir, I'm so sorry, I think you might be sitting in my seat." And he looks at his ticket, and he says, "Oh, I think you're right." And then he takes a little beat, and he looks up to me and says, "You want to sit in my lap?" Rarely am I suddenly have the very non-PC desire to go into a detailed explanation of my life history and see how he feels about the whole lap sitting afterwards. But this is something. It's true. I grew up with a lot of privilege. The privilege that comes from being white and male, and I suppose in some weird sense nominally straight, in coastal California, and I was supposed to win Nobel Prizes and achieve all sorts of amazing things. The fact that I didn't, and I'm going to share a little bit about that, doesn't take anything away from the fact that I had every advantage. The funny thing is, I was an academic when I transitioned. I had a joint appointment at Stanford and Berkeley. The day I first showed up in the lab, was the last day I was ever asked a math question. Now, it's true I have a PhD in psychology, but I also happen to have one in computational neuroscience. And like up until that day, people came and said, oh, I've got this cool new algorithm, you know, can we work on the convergence proof, and what do you think I can do with it? And like that just stopped. So my experience, I think, is actually incredibly useful. Not because it magically changes my personal history, and I'm only talking about me. Not because it magically changes my personal history, but because of the difference in what I've seen. And let me tell you, boy, there are upsides or I wouldn't have picked it. Like, I'm a better person in every way than I was, maybe push-ups, than I was before the transition. I lost about 45 pounds of upper body mass when I transitioned, and like that's the jacket thing, like I am cold all summer in Singapore is my sweet spot nowadays. My people are from cold, foggy places in the far north of the British Isles, and yet not anymore. But so we, I had this experience, and I remember like one of those first days out in Berkeley, and really early days, I feel like a gorilla in a tutu, just like everyone must know I'm a freak, and I'm walking along, and there's this woman, she's got a baby under her arm, like a rugby ball or something, and she has an umbrella stroller, and she's just trying to kick it open, and everything about this looks awkward and dangerous. And whatever, she's gonna scream, she's gonna do something, but I have to offer to help. Like, at least I can do is open the umbrella. So I walk up to her, and I say, ma'am, can I help you with anything? And she says, oh, thank you. And she gives me the baby and turns around and opens up the umbrella. And it's like, holy shit, free babies. Like, this is what happens. Like, none of this happens for guys. I realize I'm like 157 years older than everyone in this room. Well, most of you. But I don't know if anyone here ever saw Eddie Murphy's bit long ago, White Like Me, where he does the whole, like, in his case, white face. And then what happens when there's no black people around? It was like, it's a party and everyone's giving money to one another. It's true for women. Like, oh, it's so much better when there aren't guys around. Sorry, no offense. You get the testosterone out of the room and everyone's having fun. And the interesting thing is none of that was about the nature of my career. So I'm going to come back to a little bit of personal history to close this. And instead, what I'm going to focus on is a little bragging. I have had the privilege to work on some truly incredible projects over the last, whatever it is, 20, 15, 10 years. It's been an interesting time in my life. Over the last week, I've shared this stage with Bjorn, the guy who wrote Dancing Queen, one of the members of ABBA, the guy who Richard Thayer won the Nobel Prize in Economics this year, and Killinger, Henry Kissinger. Sorry, I remember the name Henry Kissinger by remembering the character from Venture Brothers. The geeks in the room get that. This is crazy. I used to get invitations regularly to the White House. They seem to have been lost in the mail the last 18 months or so. I promise if I get it, I'll give Mike Pence a big kiss. He can possibly, depending on his belief system, he can be alone with me in a room. Like, that's awesome, right? But I get to do these crazy things. And the interesting thing, just to set a little bit of context, is in working on these things, I've had to make some sacrifices. Some pretty big sacrifices. And I'm not saying boo-hoo sacrifices, but I want to set the stage of what's important to me. I get a lot of very fancy-smancy job offers on a regular basis, one of which was to be your chief scientist, which I am obviously not. I think shortly afterwards, you bought Zubin Garamandi's company, and he's awesome. He knows more about machine learning than I ever will. Similar things for Netflix. I love a good movie. I mean, my very first company ever was in the movie space, which tells you how bad of a businesswoman I am. I don't see how I'm making better people by making a movie, and that's really what I've dedicated my life to. I got a similar request from Amazon and a variety of other companies, and I've said no to all of them, not because they're not great companies, not because they don't have a meaningful impact on the world, but because I know what my purpose is. And I thought hard about every single one of these, and I think I can have a bigger impact serving my purpose with the other kinds of projects I work on. So let's talk about a few of those. I get to brag about cool things that I've done. And then we'll come back and bring me down to earth. So this is scientifically provably the cutest kid in the world. A panel of world-renowned scientists was put together, and both of us said he was. The fact that we happen to be his parents is, I mean, we're scientists, right? We're completely objective, so trust us. So Felix is awesome. And he is all the more awesome for some of the challenges that have come into his life. And it's challenges now, not just challenge. So, for example, about 6 years ago, we had this completely out of the blue. He's 4 years old, and then just suddenly became this prolific bedwetter, couldn't figure out what the hell was going on. And then it seems like he's 6. We're heading towards Thanksgiving weekend, and he's lost 15 pounds off a 40-pound frame, and we have no idea what's going on. We get into the doctor's office. I mean, they didn't even need to run a test. You could smell him. He was sweet. So it was type 1 diabetes. And if you're not familiar with what that is, it's an autoimmune disease. Your own immune system wipes out the cells that create insulin. Without insulin, you can eat whatever you want. You still starve to death. Your body can't get the sugar out of your blood and into the cells. It begins to eat itself to stay alive. That's what caused the body mass loss. So wow, like no family history on either side. If you're wondering, yes, he is my biological child, and it took a lot of science to make that happen. So we go in, we spend a long 4 days at Oakland Children's Hospital. The one thing that gives us is a lot of perspective, right? We left as a whole family, which there were a lot of families there that didn't, including some that were there for the exact same reason. So we left, and it was a shock. But the big shock for me, given the kind of work that I do, was about a month later. A month later, we came in, and during this time, my wife and I, we were so clever. Like, we started recording everything. Everything he ate, weighed to the gram. Every blood glucose level, every activity level. We put a smartwatch on him. This is the basis band, for those of you who have an ancient memory for smart devices. We are recording we crash Google Docs like repeatedly. It's gotten better, but one kid's worth of data, like crash on a regular basis. And then we thought, we're going to bring this into the doctor, and they're going to love us. I mean, what doctor doesn't want an inch-thick printout of spreadsheet to start their diagnostic process? So it turns out no doctor wants that. In fact, the nurses were angry with us, angry for wasting their time. And they gave us a sheet of paper. And it was a photocopy. It had 5 days, morning, afternoon, evening. Write a single blood glucose level in each box. All the notes we kept, the 15,000 data points we had, 15 numbers, handwritten, sheet of paper. Doctor looks at it along with the head nurse for a few minutes, and then they came up with a treatment plan. And I thought, you've got to be fucking kidding me. I make models of the brain. Are you telling me diabetes is more complex than the brain? That's insane. It's insane that a multi-billion-dollar industry is still based on people writing handwritten things on a sheet of paper. And in my wild arrogance of thinking I can do this better than actual endocrinologists, I hacked all of my son's devices. Turns out I broke several federal laws along the way. Redirected that data flow from a bunch of black box servers that I now know were essentially just empty. You know, that it's just an endless toilet of data going nowhere. And I redirected it to my own server. I actually took a model I'd used for predictive coding in the brain, repurposed it to be in sort of differential space, and built a system that predicts about an hour or more into the future whether his blood glucose levels will go high or low. So no one had ever done this before. Not because they didn't understand it. We have incredibly detailed biophysical models of insulin production and digestion and so forth. But because when I looked at that data, I didn't see a biophysical model. I saw a little boy. I saw the story of his life played out in fluctuations. This is lunch. Oh, I remember he was so angry. And now he was high during the night. That's right, we had put the food out and he didn't want to eat it. And you ask the endocrinologist, and they quite rightly would say, there's nothing there to predict. Like, we know exactly how this process happens. Turned out we saw correlations over days in time. A little boy was unhappy one morning when he woke up, and it had repercussions and echoes across multiple days in how he engaged with the world. And that's what blood glucose is. For me, is his story. And it turned out there was a lot for a predictive model to do here. So we built this thing, and we used it, and it actually worked really well, and you can experiment whatever the hell you want to on your own kids, apparently. So we ran this thing, and it's been great. And then there was this question of what to do with it. Do you start a company, take a patent out? Well, if you want to know me, then this is what you do with it. Anyone that wanted to know how I did it, I got on the phone, and I told them exactly what I did. And that included Medtronic and Eli Lilly, and it included a bunch of nonprofits. And now Dexcom has a predictive CGM coming out. It predicts about 20 minutes into the future. When they announced it a little while ago, I tweeted at them, hooray, and it only took you 4 years and $40 million more than it took me. I'm a big believer in nimble teams. But the coolest one, I have to admit, is Eli Lilly. I actually visited them in Indianapolis and gave a talk, largely to some extent because I wanted to know what it felt like to be me in Indianapolis. I mean, it wasn't so bad. This group took me out to dinner afterwards, and there was this research chemist there, and he was saying, really, it's a lot better than most people think. I mean, yeah, the neighbor kids shout faggot at me as I ride by in the morning, but really, it's not that bad. Okay, we have different standards in what you think, but I got to go there and meet with their chief scientist and their CIO and talk through some of the work they were doing. And they had taken these predictive models, built them into deep neural networks. This was sort of before that was an in vogue thing. And built them into a closed-loop insulin pump, which is called an artificial pancreas. It's only in simulation right now, but it works better than the real thing. Like, it has ethical implications. Like, if you have a family history of type 2 diabetes, do you go and get an AI-driven artificial pancreas now because we know that your long-term outcomes will be better? Are you allowed to compete in the regular Olympics if you do? Interesting things to think about. But to know that you got to do that. Like when my son is having a hard night, and he definitely has them, even with an AI helping. He's 10 years old now, and there are hard nights, and he was just diagnosed with autism, and really anyone who knows me well was like, well, no shit. So why don't you go get diagnosed? So he has his challenges, and it's pretty special. I will admit, maybe a little unique to say, I know that this is hard, and I know when we put that pump on you, it really hurt today. But because we went through this, quite possibly, literally millions of people will be alive. And you were at the heart of that. And that's really special. If that's how you measure the impact of your life, nothing else matters, right? That is so powerful. I have no idea what the next slide is. Let's hope it's something equally worth talking about. It's not. This is worth talking about, but I'm going to just leave it up there for a minute. But I'm going to throw something else out. So how did I get my updates? I built them into Google Glass. Not because it was a great platform, but it was really the only available augmented reality platform to work with at all. So we built it into Google Glass, and I could stand the occasional under-the-breath glass hole comment as I walked past, because I knew that I was getting real-time updates about my son's well-being. I actually got invited to the White House, so I mean, I really did used to. And the Secret Service freaked out because some weird woman was wearing a fluorescent blue computer with a live camera on her head at a party where both the vice president and the president were there. And I got, well, I mean, I got to meet both of them. I got to meet Joe Biden just because he happened to walk past. By the way, he has the biggest, whitest teeth of any human being on earth. Honestly, it's like if you had a sugar cube in your hand, it's like a horse. You worry that they're going to nibble your fingers off. An incredibly nice guy and inspirational, but wow. Like, is that what you have to do to be a politician? So the Secret Service wanted to kick us out. I swear to God, I asked permission ahead of time, but obviously they had no idea what they were agreeing to. So suddenly this giant man with the little curly Q thing coming out of his ear walks up to my wife and I as we're like stuffing food in our purses to smuggle out of the White House. They throw a really good party, so we just handfuls of hors d'oeuvres and desserts, and of course we thought we'd been busted. It turns out the Secret Service doesn't care if you're stealing cream puffs. They care that I had a live camera on my head, but he says, "Is that Google Glass?" "Yes." "And it does pictures?" "Yes." "It does live video." I'm like, does he want me to hook him up? I had like an early release version to like come up with clever ideas of things to do with it. And so, but then he simply says, "Please don't live stream the president." Okay. Kind of wish TSA worked that way. So I said, okay. What I didn't know but learned afterwards was I wasted 5 minutes of the most powerful man in the world's time to decide whether or not to kick me out. And what he decided is he wanted to meet me. My wife and I've almost never done a selfie in my life, but in the true spirit of being terrible party guests, we're doing a selfie with the truly touching portrait of John Kennedy, you know, the famous looking down behind us, and we're doing this crude, ugly selfie in front of it. And this little door, well, actually this guy pops up, walks up to us, is dressed like, you know, he's an admiral in the Royal Navy or something, and he says, "Take one step back and stay right here." So this little secret door pops up, and sure enough, Barack Obama walks out. And he looks straight at me and just shakes his head like, "Jesus, lady, get a clue." And he walks over, and by this point, we've realized the Secret Service have pushed everyone else away. So it's just us, and I assume some donors over here. And he walks over, big gland head, shakes their hands, walks back to me, again, big head shake. So I thought, I'm going to prove his opinion of me. My first words to the President of the United States, "Okay, Glass, take a picture." Turned out it had the exact opposite effect. So I took a picture. I've been told by Google it's the only presidential portrait ever taken with Google Glass. You can barely tell who it is because of all the specularities, and it's probably why it was such a huge success as a product. But then I got to tell him why I was wearing it. My son was in San Francisco. I was in DC, and I was getting real-time updates about his diabetes. I actually got a message that said that in half an hour his blood glucose levels would go low. And I was able to text my sister, back actually in Brisbane, and tell her to give him a cracker. And he didn't go low. But that wasn't the only project I got to do with Google Glass. So in the introduction, it was mentioned that we built this system to reunite orphan refugees with extended family members. So the actual heart of that was when I was an undergrad, I worked at this place. I did my undergrad at UC San Diego, and I worked at this lab called the Machine Perception Lab. And we were working on this incredibly cool, but definitely morally gray project, doing real-time lie detection for the CIA off of raw video. And that was my introduction to machine learning. I mean, I didn't really know how to code at that point. And I walked into this lab, and in a little bit I'll tell you about the experience of actually getting there in the first place. But so I walk into this project, and I mention it not because I'm going to go into detail, but that lab spun off as a startup And then that startup had the clever idea of doing a real-time expression recognition analysis on YouTube of one of the early Republican presidential debates, when there was like, 197 of them on stage, and everyone really wants to know whether Ted Cruz is an actual human being or not. And what an amazing project. I mean, from a business standpoint, because the next day the bidding war starts between Apple and Facebook. Apple won, so if you've got an iPhone 10, all of the new face stuff on it, that's all my old undergraduate lab. So I was not obviously part of that purchase, because it just happened recently. It does tell you something, though. Literally, that must have been 24 dissertations worth of research went into that technology, 20 years worth of backbreaking labor, and now it animates cat videos. That's like all innovation in the end animates cats on phones. So you just learn to live with that and try and do good as you go along. So this was my approach to doing good. The project that reunited the orphan refugees with extended family members was based on that same face recognition technology. And then I also took that and built it into Google Glass. Now there's all sorts of nefarious things you could do with that. I could, of course, conceivably do the whole lie detection thing. I could float your credit scores over your heads, or pull up your social media profiles. So we built this for autistic kids, so that they could learn how to read facial expressions in natural interactions with other people. And it turns out that's more than just a prosthetic. It's more than just training. So the standard against which you compare this, maybe or maybe not, I will ever get to the rest of the talk, is cartoon faces on flashcards. So what does a cartoon face lack? So clearly it has a big smile or a big frown. It's really easy to tell whether it's happy or sad. But why is it happy or sad? What does understanding facial expressions from a cartoon tell you about empathy? So one of these two challenges that are well known for autistic kids is reading facial expressions. They can learn how. It's like a second language. So it's hard, it's deliberative, but they can learn. And another one is empathy, theory of mind. So are they related? Turns out they are. When these kids learn how to read facial expressions by actually interacting with people that have actual emotional states and motivations and reasons, they learn empathy, which seemed like something they couldn't do. And they couldn't do it because we trained them that the world was full of people that are just arbitrarily happy and sad. And how would you possibly have learned otherwise if you didn't get it for free like the rest of us? So 5 more minutes. No, we won't be going into a lot of detail here, but I will go into one thing. So these are kind of the projects. I'm just going to throw this one out here without a deep description. A new project at my think tank is working with the Make-A-Wish Foundation. We're helping the kids make better wishes, as measured by, are they more likely to survive? Are their families more likely to stay together through the trauma? Are there even economic impacts on their broader neighborhood? That is how I want to spend my life. I want to spend my life making other people's lives better, because I truly believe, in a very numbers-driven way, because I am a very numbers-driven scientist, that this flows back. I want my kids to grow up in that world. This could have been a talk about how it sucks to be a woman in business. What this is, this idea of a tax on being different. I have a book coming out about that. I don't know, go buy it, and then you'll learn the story. Presumably, my life is great for coming up with books ideas. It's terrible for actually getting finished books written. But we were able to actually go through with a data set of 122 million people and actually measure what it meant to be a woman in technology in an actual economic sense. Not that I think people's lives are dollar and cents, but if I want to have a conversation with Jeb Bush about what discrimination means, I need a common language. And what's the dirtiest word in the conservative language? Tax. So let's call it exactly what it is. It's a tax. But it doesn't pave roads, it doesn't build bridges, it doesn't pay for defense, nothing we would want a tax to otherwise do. It's simply heat loss in our economy. It's lost to Uber. Yes, of course, you are paying it directly. In fact, I would say pretty much many people in one facet or another are paying it in this room. But of course, in paying it, which means more prestigious schools, going for longer periods of time, working longer before you get a justified promotion. Like, this is waste, and we need to fix that. The numbers get big. You know, I'm sorry I skipped over some of it, but I wanted to talk about this a little bit. So what does it mean to grow up under a tax? You know, if when you grow up, you might measurably be working twice as hard as the person next to you. Well, you want to understand. So I'll finish this, then I'm going to deliver one little quote, and then we can maybe do some questions if there's any time left. If you want to understand the wage gap, for example, this has been really well researched by people I greatly respect. Raj Chetty down at Stanford, likely to get a Nobel Prize. If I had money on anybody, it will be him. James Heckman has a Nobel Prize. Two very progressive economists, and like many others, they've looked at wage gap. And I have two problems with their research. One is their finding. You know, women raise families. That's largely what drives the wage gap. It's unfair because you have to pay it whether or not you actually have a family, but this is the dynamic. So I think that's a good description of what. What is going on? That's not a description, though, of why. You all worked incredibly hard to get here. You've worked hard your whole life. Hard to get into great schools, hard to get the right jobs, to learn how to be a great developer. And now, like, suddenly, out of the blue, you're realizing maybe you want to raise a family, and oh, well, screw all this. I'm going to just make a completely different choice. So we looked across 60,000 companies. We looked at wage gap, and we looked for variables. I mean, if this was your choice, then it should be the same across all companies. It should just be random differences, but it's not. So we looked for variables that were predictive of wage gap. And you're looking at one. And of course, I did this in my own way. I built little spiders that crawled through and did facial analysis of their board and their C-suite. The number of women in those pictures was the single biggest explanatory variable. More women in leadership, lower wage gap. Is it because of policies? Turns out, more women in leadership, same spend on diversity and inclusion initiatives, bigger impact. A year subsequent to a woman taking a leadership position, particularly something like CEO, CFO, wage gap drops regardless of whether there's changes in policy or not. Why? So we call this belief-based utility in behavioral economics. The belief that your hard work is going to pay off. If you're already working twice as hard as the person next to you, and that may not be a bad way of thinking about it, and then you look up and you see that. That, by the way, is the executive team at Royal Dutch Shell. A few years ago, they've actually brought some women in since then. A Dutch friend of mine insisted that I note that they've gotten better. That turns out to be the biggest explainer. What's the point? Why am I working so incredibly hard if there is no evidence that it will ever pay off? It is amazing. This is part of the role of role-playing and role modeling in leadership. It's amazing what it communicates to everyone in the organization that they themselves are part of this process. There's so many other things I can talk about in this domain, and I probably have slides. Oh, it's Sexy Face. This is the system that reunited the orphan refugees with their families. You're seeing a layer out of the model learning about faces. And here's something about neuroprosthetics. Who cares? So I'm going to finish with this and an accompanying quote. This is when I want to do a call out to the rest of you. You have the opportunity through an incredibly influential organization to have an impact on the world, and that is a special privilege. So when you're building these things, I know the design ethic is make it easy, make it addictive, make it everything. I know you're not a social network, but there's elements to using Uber which can be addictive and really want you to drive and make use. I'm going to call on you to make it challenging. And what I mean by that is people shouldn't just be better when they're using your product. They should be better than where they started when they turn it off again. And this does not happen very much. We tend to look at product development in terms of how much can I get away with? And that's really a problem. And it's not unique to technology. This is a problem in the law, and it's a problem in business, and it's a problem all around. How much can I get away with rather than what value can I add back in. So let me finish with this. I had this very flattering experience recently. I'm not even going to tell my personal story, whatever. So this very flattering experience recently. I was asked to give a keynote at Grace Hopper, and I wasn't able to go. And unbeknownst to me, they threw a quote from me up on the wall. And it was like with Malala and all these, wow, like, okay. And someone tweeted this at me. And it was, ambitious men are promising us self-driving cars and spaceships and artificial intelligence. If every little girl had been given the reins to her own potential, we already have them. And now if you just don't think of every little girl, you think of every kid that was born into a life that never gave them the chance to decide for themselves who they would be. And you realize the vast majority of people in this world will never, ever have a chance to do what you guys are doing. They will never have a chance to live my life. And I can selfishly look at that and think, that is wrong. That tax is making all of our lives worse, and it has to end. You have a global reach, and you have an opportunity to make a difference. Please go do it. I will only say this. I flunked out of college and was homeless for several years, and I look back on my life now in the same spirit of what I said to my son earlier. How many lives could I have saved had I had those 10 years back? And that haunts me. How many people, the person that will invent the cure to your child's disease was just born in Dakar, and they will never have the chance to live the life that will lead them to that cure. Please be selfish and do real good in this world. Thank you very much.